In 1945, an Egyptian peasant made a discovery that would forever change our understanding of early Christianity. Hidden in the sands of Nag Hammadi, an ancient text would reveal one of the most controversial theories about Jesus Christ. What he found would challenge 2,000 years of established Christian doctrine. The document in question was not just another religious manuscript lost to time. It was the Gospel of Philip, a Gnostic text that presented Jesus in a completely different light than that known to believers around the world. Its pages contained assertions that would shake the Vatican to its most sacred foundations. Among the most shocking revelations was a passage suggesting an intimate relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The text not only hinted at a special connection, but seemed to indicate something far deeper and revolutionary. A truth that, if confirmed, would rewrite the entire history of early Christianity. For decades, scholars furiously debated the authenticity and meaning of these ancient words. Some dismissed them as pure heresy, while others saw them as a window into the true nature of Christ. The Catholic Church, meanwhile, maintained a deafening silence on these disturbing discoveries. If you are ready for a journey that will question everything you believe you know about Jesus Christ, subscribe to the channel right now. Activate the bell so you don't miss a single detail of this explosive investigation, because what you are about to discover may change your faith forever. Starting with the mysterious circumstances that surrounded this revolutionary archaeological find. Muhammad Ali al-Salman never imagined that his search for fertilizer in the caves near the village of Nag Hammadi would make him the protagonist of one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Armed with only a pickaxe and driven by necessity, he penetrated the rocky depths of Upper Egypt on that fateful December morning. What his eyes found defied all rational explanation. A perfectly preserved red ceramic jar lay buried as if patiently waiting for centuries for the right moment to reveal its secrets. Initially hesitant, Muhammad feared the vessel might contain evil spirits, as warned by ancient local legends. Curiosity, however, overcame fear. Upon carefully breaking the sealed jar, 13 papyrus codices emerged from the darkness, wrapped in leather and tied with ancient cords. These manuscripts had remained hidden since approximately 350 AD, when Christian monks concealed them to protect them from the religious persecution sweeping Egypt. Among these sacred texts was the controversial Gospel of Philip, a document that presented teachings attributed to Jesus' closest apostles. Unlike the canonical Gospels, this text offered a radically different perspective on Christ's divine nature and his most intimate earthly relationships. Muhammad did not comprehend the magnitude of his discovery, but he soon realized he held something valuable in his hands. The fate of these manuscripts, however, would be as turbulent as their explosive content, passing through smugglers, collectors, and finally reaching the hands of scholars who would recognize their true revolutionary value. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts did not easily reach global academic knowledge. For years, they circulated in the black market for antiquities, fragmented and sold separately by dealers who were completely unaware of the theological treasure they possessed. Each page represented a piece of the most controversial puzzle in early Christian history. When they finally reached universities and research institutes, the texts caused a veritable intellectual earthquake. Renowned scholars like James Robinson and Elaine Pagels dedicated decades to translating and interpreting these Gnostic documents. What they discovered fundamentally challenged the established narratives about the first centuries of Christianity. The Gospel of Philip stood out among the other texts for its audacious claims about the human nature of Jesus Christ. Written likely in the 3rd or 4th century, this Gnostic gospel presented teachings that the early church had deliberately suppressed. Its pages contained secrets that could shake the faith of millions of Christians worldwide. Unlike the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospel of Philip did not follow a chronological narrative of Jesus' life. Instead, it presented a collection of sayings, parables, and mystical revelations that offered unique insights into the esoteric teachings of the Master of Nazareth. The Catholic Church watched these discoveries with growing concern, recognizing the destructive potential these ancient texts possessed. What alarmed it most was a specific passage suggesting a special relationship between Jesus and one of his most devoted followers, a revelation that would call into question centuries of established doctrine. Long before the discovery of Nag Hammadi, Mary Magdalene already occupied an enigmatic position in Christian tradition. The canonical Gospels mention her as one of Jesus' most faithful followers, present at his teachings, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. However, her true importance had been deliberately obscured over the centuries. Later ecclesiastical tradition transformed Mary Magdalene into a repentant prostitute, a characterization that many modern scholars consider an intentional historical distortion. This reinterpretation served to diminish her fundamental role in the early Christian community and establish a dominant male hierarchy in the leadership of the nascent church. The Gnostic texts, however, painted a completely different picture of Mary Magdalene. In these documents, she appeared as a privileged disciple, possessing special knowledge transmitted directly by Jesus Christ. Her relationship with the Master transcended the typical dynamic between teacher and student, suggesting a unique spiritual intimacy. The Gospel of Philip went even further in its revelations about Mary Magdalene. The text presented her as Jesus' companion, using terminology that implied a relationship far closer than Christian tradition had ever publicly admitted. This characterization directly challenged the image of the celibate Christ promoted by the Church. The implications of these revelations were too profound to ignore. If Mary Magdalene truly occupied such a special position in Jesus' life, it would mean the Church had intentionally suppressed evidence of a fundamental aspect of Christ's humanity, paving the way for one of the most explosive theological controversies of modern history. Among all the revelations contained in the Gospel of Philip, one passage in particular stood out as especially controversial and explosive. The text, written in Coptic, described the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene in a way that challenged 2,000 years of established Christian teachings. The ancient word seemed to suggest something unthinkable to traditional doctrine. The passage in question stated that Jesus used to kiss her often, and that he loved her more than all the disciples. The text went on to explain that the other apostles questioned Jesus about why he loved Mary more than them. This intimate description painted a radically different picture of the dynamics within Christ's inner circle. More disturbing still was the use of the word companion to describe Mary Magdalene. In the context of the time, this term carried connotations that went far beyond a simple spiritual friendship. Scholars debated intensely whether the original word could be translated as wife or intimate partner, interpretations that would completely revolutionize our understanding of Jesus. The text also suggested that Mary Magdalene possessed special knowledge that Jesus had not shared with the other disciples. This revelation implied a spiritual hierarchy that placed a woman in a position of prominence, something completely contrary to the patriarchal structure that the early church had later established. The discovery of this passage provoked visceral reactions from both defenders and critics. Some saw in it evidence of a millennia-old conspiracy to hide the true human nature of Jesus, while others rejected it as baseless Gnostic heresy, setting the stage for one of the most heated theological debates of the modern era. The issue of Jesus Christ's celibacy has always been fundamental to Christian doctrine, especially within the Roman Catholic tradition. For centuries, the Church taught that Jesus remained celibate throughout his earthly life, using this belief as justification for mandatory clerical celibacy. This doctrine became one of the pillars of Catholic priestly identity. The canonical Gospels, curiously, never explicitly state that Jesus was celibate. This conclusion was primarily inferred from the absence of mentions of a wife or family. However, modern scholars point out that, in the first-century Jewish context, marriage was not only common, but practically obligatory for men Jesus' age. The Jewish culture of the time considered celibacy an anomaly, especially for rabbis and religious leaders. The Talmud and other ancient Jewish sources emphasized the importance of marriage and procreation as divine commandments. An unmarried man in his 30s would be considered highly unusual, if not suspect, in that society. Some scholars argue that if Jesus had indeed been celibate, the evangelists would have explicitly mentioned this extraordinary fact, given its cultural uniqueness. The absence of such a mention could, paradoxically, suggest that Jesus followed the normal marital patterns of his time, making marriage something so natural that it required no special comment. The Gospel of Philip, therefore, did not present a completely revolutionary idea, but possibly revealed a historical truth that had been deliberately obscured. This possibility opened the way for even deeper questions about what other aspects of Jesus' life might have been altered or suppressed by later ecclesiastical tradition. Gnosticism represented an alternative current of early Christianity that emphasized direct and personal knowledge of God, in contrast to faith based on ecclesiastical authority. Gnostics believed that Jesus had imparted secret teachings to a select circle of disciples, knowledge that transcended the public doctrines recorded in the canonical Gospels. This esoteric tradition particularly valued feminine wisdom and the role of women in transmitting divine mysteries. Mary Magdalene held a central position in this Gnostic cosmology, being seen as the privileged recipient of Christ's deepest teachings. Her special closeness to Jesus was not merely physical, but represented a fundamental spiritual union. Gnostic texts frequently presented dialogues between the resurrected Jesus and his disciples, revealing hidden truths about the nature of reality and the path to salvation. In these mystical conversations, Mary Magdalene appeared as the principal interlocutor, demonstrating a superior understanding of the Master's teachings that often provoked jealousy in the male disciples. The early church viewed Gnosticism as an existential threat to its authority and doctrinal orthodoxy. Church leaders feared that these alternative teachings could fragment Christian unity and undermine institutional control over the interpretation of Scripture. This tension resulted in systematic persecution of Gnostic groups. The violent suppression of Gnostic texts in the 4th century AD represented a decisive victory of Christian orthodoxy over alternative currents. However, the burial of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts preserved these dissenting voices, allowing their controversial revelations to resurface in the 20th century to once again challenge established certainties about the nature of Jesus Christ. When the Nag Hammadi texts began to circulate in academic circles, the Vatican initially maintained a strategic silence on their theological implications. Internally, however, special commissions of Catholic scholars were formed to meticulously analyze each document and develop official responses to the most controversial questions raised by the Gnostic manuscripts. The Holy See recognized that these discoveries represented an unprecedented challenge to the Church's doctrinal authority. The Gospel of Philip, in particular, threatened theological foundations that had remained unquestioned for nearly 2 millennia. The possibility of Jesus having been married called into question not only the doctrine of clerical celibacy, but all of traditional Christology. Internal Vatican documents, later leaked, revealed intense discussions among cardinals and theologians about how to adequately respond to these revelations. Some advocated for a defensive approach, categorically rejecting the authenticity of the Gnostic texts. Others suggested a more nuanced response, acknowledging the historical value of the manuscripts while maintaining doctrinal orthodoxy. The official strategy adopted by the Church was to systematically discredit the Gnostic texts as products of heretical sects from the 3rd and 4th centuries, having no value for understanding the historical Jesus. Catholic scholars were instructed to emphasize the superiority of the canonical Gospels and question the reliability of Gnostic sources in academic and popular publications. However, this discrediting campaign failed to prevent the Nag Hammadi discoveries from profoundly influencing modern biblical studies. The seed of doubt had been planted, and questions about the true nature of Jesus Christ began to proliferate among scholars, clergy, and believers, creating fissures in the apparent doctrinal unanimity that the Church had carefully cultivated over centuries. Beyond the testimony of the Gospel of Philip, other historical and textual evidence suggests the possibility that Jesus may have been married. Independent scholars began to re-examine the canonical Gospels with new eyes, searching for clues that might have been overlooked by generations of interpreters influenced by the doctrine of celibacy later established by the Church. Mary Magdalene's constant presence at the most crucial moments of Jesus' life intrigued researchers. She was present at the crucifixion when most of the male disciples had fled, was the first witness to the resurrection, and received special instructions to announce the good news to the other apostles. This prominent role suggested a unique position in the hierarchy of Christ's followers. Linguistic analyses of the original texts revealed nuances that were lost in later translations. Certain expressions used to describe the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene carried intimate connotations that were deliberately softened in the Church's official versions. These philological discoveries provided additional support for the claims found in the Gnostic texts. Jesus' behavior towards women also challenged the social norms of his time in ways that could be explained by his marital experience. His defense of the adulterous woman, his teachings on divorce, and his respectful attitude towards women in general suggested an intimate understanding of the female condition that transcended the typical perspective of a celibate. Apocryphal documents beyond the Gospel of Philip also contained references to the special relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of Mary, another Gnostic text, presented intimate dialogues between the two that suggested a deep and unique connection, providing corroborating evidence for the more controversial claims about Christ's personal life. If you are following this explosive investigation and want to discover all the secrets the Church has tried to hide for centuries, subscribe to the channel right now. Leave your like so that more people can access these historical revelations that can change our understanding of Christianity forever. Comment below with your opinion on these controversial discoveries. The systematic suppression of Gnostic texts in the 4th century AD was not a historical accident, but the result of a deliberate campaign to establish a single, controlled version of the Christian message. Emperor Constantine and the church leaders of the time recognized that doctrinal diversity represented a threat to the political and religious unity they wished to build in the Roman Empire. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD marked the official beginning of this doctrinal standardization, but debates about which texts should be considered canonical continued for decades. During this process, Gospels that presented alternative views of Jesus, especially those that emphasized his humanity or revealed personal aspects of his life, were systematically excluded and later persecuted. The organized destruction of Gnostic manuscripts represented one of the greatest losses of historical knowledge from antiquity. Entire libraries were burned, scribes were persecuted, and alternative Christian communities were forced into clandestinity. Only the courageous decision of some monks to hide the Nag Hammadi texts preserved these dissenting voices for posterity. This suppression campaign had lasting consequences that extended far beyond antiquity. The image of Jesus as an exclusively divine and celibate figure became so ingrained in the Christian consciousness that any suggestion of his full humanity was seen as blasphemy. The result was a historical distortion that persisted for nearly 2 millennia. The rediscovery of Gnostic texts in the 20th century, therefore, represented more than a mere archaeological find. It was the resurrection of silenced voices that offered alternative perspectives on the origins of Christianity, forcing scholars and believers to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of historical truth and the construction of religious orthodoxy. Renowned biblical scholars began to publicly defend the possibility that Jesus may have been married, basing their arguments not only on Gnostic texts, but also on 1st century historical and cultural evidence. Among them, Professor William Phipps stood out, whose book, Was Jesus Married?, caused a furor in academic and religious circles by presenting convincing arguments about Christ's marital life. Professor Karen King of Harvard became one of the most respected voices in this debate, translating and interpreting the Coptic manuscripts of Nag Hammadi. Her studies on the role of women in early Christianity revealed a reality very different from that promoted by later ecclesiastical tradition, where female figures occupied positions of leadership and spiritual authority. Archaeologist Shimon Gibson presented physical evidence that could corroborate the theory of Jesus' marriage. His excavations at first-century sites in Palestine revealed housing and social patterns that made celibacy extremely rare among men of Jesus' age and social standing. These archaeological discoveries provided crucial historical context for the theological debate. Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln, in their controversial book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, went beyond conventional academic evidence, suggesting that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had descendants who settled in medieval France. Although their theories were considered speculative by many scholars, they captured the popular imagination and intensified public interest in these issues. Dan Brown capitalized on this growing fascination in his novel, The Da Vinci Code, which popularized the theory of Jesus' marriage worldwide to mainstream audiences. Although fictional, the book was based on real academic research and forced millions of readers to question their assumptions about Christian history, creating an unprecedented demand for information on these controversial topics. The conservative academic community reacted vigorously to theories about Jesus' marriage, mobilizing its intellectual resources to systematically refute every argument presented by the proponents of this hypothesis. Scholars like Craig Blomberg and Darrell Bach published extensive critiques of the Gnostic texts, questioning their dating, authenticity, and relevance to understanding the historical Jesus. Critics argued that the Gnostic Gospels were written centuries after the events they described, making them unreliable historical sources. They contrasted this late dating with the canonical Gospels, which were composed much closer in time to Jesus' life. This chronological difference, they argued, invalidated any claims based solely on Gnostic texts. Catholic and Protestant theologians joined forces to defend the traditional doctrine of Jesus' celibacy, arguing that marriage would be incompatible with his divine mission. They maintained that the absence of any mention of a wife in the canonical Gospels constituted definitive evidence that Jesus remained unmarried throughout his earthly life. Some scholars questioned the translations and interpretations of the Gnostic texts, suggesting that words like companion could have purely spiritual meanings rather than marital connotations. They argued that proponents of the marriage theory were reading meanings into ancient sources that were not originally present in the texts. The Catholic Church intensified its efforts to discredit these theories, publishing official documents that reaffirmed traditional doctrine and warned believers against erroneous interpretations of archaeological discoveries. This institutional response revealed the depth of the threat these theories posed to established doctrinal authority, paving the way for even more intense confrontations between orthodoxy and independent research. The early Christian communities preserved oral traditions about Mary Magdalene that differed significantly from the image later promoted by the institutional church. Patristic texts from the 2nd and 3rd centuries mention her special role as Apostle to the Apostles, a title that recognized her unique position as the first witness to the resurrection and an authorized messenger of Christ. Hippolytus of Rome, one of the earliest Christian theologians, wrote extensively about Mary Magdalene, describing her as a model of faith and devotion who surpassed even the male disciples in her understanding of divine mysteries. His writings suggested she possessed her own doctrinal authority, derived directly from her intimate encounters with the resurrected Jesus. The Coptic tradition preserved even more detailed narratives about the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, including descriptions of private conversations and special teachings she allegedly received. These texts, discovered in Egyptian monasteries, provided independent evidence corroborating the claims found in the Nag Hammadi manuscripts about her privileged position. Paintings and mosaics from the early Christian centuries often depicted Mary Magdalene in prominent positions, sometimes alongside Jesus in contexts that suggested spiritual equality. These artistic representations reflected a tradition that recognized her fundamental importance in the early Christian community, before later revisions diminished her historical role. The gradual transformation of Mary Magdalene from a privileged disciple into a repentant prostitute represented one of the most dramatic historical revisions perpetrated by the medieval church. This reinterpretation not only diminished her spiritual status, but also served to obscure evidence of her special relationship with Jesus, effectively eliminating any textual basis for questions about Christ's marital life. To adequately understand the probability of Jesus having been married, it is essential to examine the cultural and religious context of first-century Judaism. In this society, marriage was not merely a personal choice, but a fundamental religious obligation based on the biblical commandment to be fruitful and multiply. Unmarried men were viewed with suspicion and considered spiritually incomplete. The rabbis of the time taught that an unmarried man could not be considered fully mature or qualified for certain religious responsibilities. The Talmud contains numerous passages emphasizing the importance of marriage for spiritual leaders, suggesting it would be highly unlikely for Jesus, as a traveling rabbi, to remain celibate without provoking significant commentary and controversy. The typical age for male marriage in the first century was between 18 and 20 years old, making Jesus, at 30 years old at the start of his public ministry, statistically anomalous if he were unmarried. This demographic discrepancy becomes even more pronounced considering his position as a respected religious leader, a role that normally demanded marital and family stability. Synagogues of the time functioned as community centers where family matters were openly discussed. If Jesus were celibate, this extraordinary fact would surely have generated debates and explanations that should have been recorded in the Gospels. Given its cultural uniqueness, the absence of such discussions could indicate that his marital status was perfectly normal for the era. Jewish groups that practiced celibacy, such as the Essenes of Qumran, were considered marginal sects that deliberately isolated themselves from mainstream society. Jesus, on the other hand, actively participated in social life, attended weddings, dinners, and community celebrations, behavior more consistent with a socially integrated married man than a celibate ascetic. The episode of the wedding at Cana, recorded in the Gospel of John, contains intriguing details that some scholars interpret as evidence of Jesus' marital status. The presence of his mother Mary at the event, his apparent authority to give orders to the servants, and the central role he plays in the celebration suggest a deeper familial involvement than simply being a common guest. Jesus' initial response to his mother, "Woman, what concern is that to me?" has been reinterpreted by some scholars as an expression of familial intimacy appropriate for marital occasions. In the Jewish cultural context, this language could indicate that Jesus had specific responsibilities at the ceremony, possibly as the groom or a close relative of the bride and groom. The fact that Jesus was sought out when the wine ran out suggests he had some responsibility for the success of the celebration. In Jewish weddings of the time, this responsibility would typically fall to the groom, the parents of the bride and groom, or close relatives with specific familial obligations. The natural reaction of the organizers in seeking out Jesus indicates his special position at the event. The exceptional quality of the wine Jesus produced prompted specific comments from the master of ceremonies, who noted that inferior wine was usually served later. For over 1700 years, the Catholic Church maintained absolute silence on any possibility of Jesus having been married. Documents suggesting this theory were systematically suppressed, burned, or hidden in the deepest archives of the Vatican. The strategy was clear: completely ignore these issues so they would disappear from collective memory. But the Gospel of Philip represented something different. It was not just another obscure apocryphal text that few knew. Its language was direct, its claims were specific, and its preservation in Nag Hammadi ensured it reached modern times virtually intact. Silence would no longer be a viable option. The Church's conservative theologians faced an unprecedented dilemma: how to explain these passages without giving credibility to the document, how to deny it without drawing attention. Any official response could be interpreted as an admission that there was something to hide. It was best to continue pretending the text simply didn't exist. However, the information age was making the strategy increasingly unsustainable. Independent scholars began asking uncomfortable questions at universities, seminaries, and theological conferences. The pressure for answers grew exponentially, and the Vatican knew it could not ignore the situation forever. What most worried church authorities was the possibility of other similar documents emerging. If Jesus was indeed married, there would surely be more evidence hidden somewhere. And if this evidence were discovered, the entire theological edifice built over 2 millennia could crumble like a house of cards. If Jesus was truly married to Mary Magdalene, the theological implications would be absolutely devastating for traditional Christianity. The doctrine of clerical celibacy, established as a divine commandment, would completely lose its biblical basis. How to justify the prohibition of marriage for priests if Christ himself was married? The special veneration of virginity, elevated by the Church as a superior state of spiritual purity, would also completely collapse. If the Son of God chose to marry and possibly have children, how to maintain that celibacy represents a holier path? The entire hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church would need to be rethought from its foundations. Even more disturbing would be the role of Mary Magdalene in the history of Christianity. If she was truly Jesus' wife, her importance would be infinitely greater than any other female figure in religion. This would directly challenge the subordination of women in the ecclesiastical structure and open precedents for female priesthood. The very divine nature of Christ could be questioned by some believers. If Jesus experienced the human condition fully, including marital love and possibly fatherhood, this would strengthen his humanity, but could, in the minds of some, diminish his. It was an extremely dangerous theological territory for Christian orthodoxy. Religious leaders understood perfectly that these questions were not merely academic. They touched the heart of the faith of millions of people and could provoke a crisis of authority unprecedented in the Church's history. While the Church maintained its strategic silence, independent historians and archaeologists intensified their research into the real life of Jesus of Nazareth. They knew the answer would not come from official pronouncements, but from concrete evidence buried in the sands of time. Every archaeological discovery in the Holy Land was examined with a magnifying glass, searching for clues about the historical Jesus. Studies on first-century marital customs revealed fascinating data. It was practically unthinkable for a 30-year-old Jewish rabbi to remain unmarried at that time. Marriage was not only expected, but considered a religious obligation. The absence of any mention of Jesus' celibacy in the canonical Gospels was becoming increasingly significant. Researchers began to re-examine references to Mary Magdalene in biblical texts with new eyes. Her constant presence at Jesus' side, her prominent position among the disciples, and especially her role as the first witness to the resurrection, took on new meanings. Why did she, and not Peter or John, receive this supreme honor? Linguistic analysis of the Gnostic Gospels revealed interesting patterns. The term used to describe the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, had specific connotations in Aramaic and Coptic. It was not simply companion in a casual sense, but indicated an intimate and permanent union. Each new discovery added another piece to the puzzle, and the picture emerging fundamentally challenged the official narrative that Christianity had accepted for almost 2,000 years. The revelation that Jesus might have been married did not destroy Christian faith, but transformed it in unexpected ways. Millions of believers around the world discovered that a more human Jesus, who experienced marital love, actually strengthened their personal connection to the Savior. He was not a distant, unattainable figure, but someone who fully understood the human experience. Many Christian couples found new meaning in their marriages, seeing them not as concessions to human weakness, but as reflections of Christ's own experience. Marital love gained an even deeper sacred dimension, and marital intimacy was revalued as an expression of divine creation. It was a silent but profound revolution. Christian women, in particular, felt empowered by this new perspective. If Mary Magdalene was truly Jesus' wife, it would dramatically elevate the feminine role in the divine plan. She was not merely a follower, but an intimate partner in the redemptive mission. This opened important theological precedents for gender equality in the Church. More progressive Protestant denominations began to incorporate these ideas into their theologies, emphasizing Christ's complete humanity. Theological seminaries included courses on the Gnostic Gospels, and a new generation of pastors emerged with a broader understanding of the historical person of Jesus. Paradoxically, far from weakening Christianity, these revelations made it more relevant to the modern world, where marriage and family are central values for most people. Today, decades after the discovery of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, the question remains without a definitive answer. Was Jesus truly married to Mary Magdalene? Does the Gospel of Philip contain historical truths or just Gnostic speculations? Science and archaeology continue to search for conclusive evidence, but the mystery persists, fascinating believers and skeptics alike. What we know for sure is that this question has forever changed our understanding of early Christianity. It revealed the diversity of beliefs that existed in the first centuries, before orthodoxy consolidated. It showed that many issues we consider resolved were actually decided by councils and ecclesiastical authorities, not necessarily by irrefutable historical evidence. The Vatican finally broke its secular silence, but its statements were cautious and diplomatic. It acknowledged the historical importance of the Gnostic texts without endorsing their claims. It maintained its traditional position, but admitted that there is still much to learn about the historical Jesus. It was a subtle but significant opening. For millions of people around the world, the possibility of a married Jesus is not a threat to faith, but an invitation to a richer, more human understanding of the Savior. If he truly loved a woman, it does not make him less divine, but closer to our human experience. Love, after all, is considered by Christians to be the very essence of God. The mystery continues, and perhaps it is better that way. Some questions are more powerful than their answers, and the search for the truth about Jesus, historical and divine, remains a fascinating journey that each generation must undertake for itself.